So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this country, the Gadigal people of the Eora land, and the law of the country on which the University of Sydney campuses stand. We pay our respects to those who have cared and continue to care for country. Now, I have our two panellists sitting up in front of you, Tim Johnson and Katrina Liberia. I'll invite them to come here to each give a talk about an aspect of the exhibition. Unfortunately, Mark Ledbury, our third panellist, is sick. So I have expanded my introduction to fill his space. So without further ado, I'll just start with my first image. Now, I am having problems. Right, we're off and running. Light and Darkness is based on the Power Collection, a major legacy of the artist benefactor, Dr. John Wardell Power, who graduated in medicine from the university in 1905. His great bequest challenged the university, and these are his words, to bring the people of Australia in more direct touch with the latest art developments in other countries. And out of that bequest, the Fine Arts Department was created as the Power Institute in 1967, alongside the beginnings of the Power Collection. That collection includes over 1,400 artworks and an archive which bears witness to the intellectual ferment and excitement that Power's gifts made possible. Why light and darkness? About 4 years ago, when Katrina and I began thinking about how best to represent the Power Collection, we thought we'd take our cue from the light works that were a major feature of the early Power acquisitions and trace the theme of light and darkness. And we, in fact, had more than twice as many works selected as would fit within our major new temporary exhibition. But we culled it down, and we're really delighted to have one of the artists, Tim Johnson, who will be talking about his work shortly. But in 1968, the Power Collection was unveiled as this kind of futuristic spectacle within the architecture of Harry Seidler's new Australia Square project. And in fact, Seidler himself curated the exhibition. Then the Power Collection went on to become the basis of the new museum, or the then new Museum of Contemporary Art at Circular Quay in the early 90s. And so the final Power acquisition was made in 1989. So that's 3 decades, and that's the extent of the exhibition. Those 3 decades span the rise and fall, as I said on the little film, of the Berlin Wall, that symbol of the Cold War, and in a sense, the end of the short 20th century, certainly in terms of the idea of modernism. Now, while the Power Collection was launched in the late 60s, really it's only now with this great new museum that we have really given it a permanent home here at the university. Now, I'm just going to go into a little bit of history about light art, because I think it's useful to see some of the origins when artists first began to experiment with light using new forms and technologies. And I'd trace it back to the Weimar Bauhaus, the very early days of the Bauhaus, 1922, 1923, there artists like Ludwig Hirschfeld Mack, whose story ends up in Australia, and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy produced some of the very first light machines. In fact, during the Second World War, Hirschfeld Mack, being German, was deported as an enemy alien from England, where he had fled the Nazis, and arrived on the Dunera in Australia. And he would become here a major advocate for Bauhaus ideas. And just in terms of, there's Moholy-Nagy's wonderful light space modulator, and there's Hirschfeld Mack himself at the Bauhaus working with some fellow students. He's on the piano on his Farbenlicht machine. But later on in Australia, he ends up exhibiting a history of the Bauhaus and accompanying it with a publication in which he describes some of those early experiments. And I just want to read you a brief account of this particular machine. He says, "We experimented for 2 years with reflected light compositions to control actual movements of light shapes in rhythmic succession, colours, points, lines on a screen until mastery of this possible future art was successfully achieved. These reflected light compositions, Farbenlichtspiel, were produced in German theatres in Berlin and Hamburg and at a music festival in Vienna in 1923, where they were shown with Fernand Léger's experimental films, Ballet Mécanique." So that's the end of the quote from Hirschfeld Mack. In part to acknowledge this significant historic precursor, the Chau Chak Wing Museum recently commissioned a contemporary artist, Michael Candy, to reconstruct Hirschfeld Mack's Farbenlichtspiel. And there you can see it, but he used various digital technologies. The new, that's it in the foreground. The new version allows for levels of interactivity from the museum visitor who can turn handles to manipulate the LED lights. And it has been shown in that way in both Melbourne and Brisbane, and we hope to show it sometime here with artists and musicians performing and improvising on the play of colours. In Australia, it was another outsider, the Polish-born emigre, Stanislaus Ostoja-Kotkowski, who was struck by the possibilities of light art when working in the outback in the mid-1950s. He observed, "The terrific iridescence you can get behind the eyes in Central Australia forces you to think of the source of light, whether it's beam, lantern or sun, and to think of it as the most impressive, most flexible and richest tool imaginable for an artist." In fact, Ostoja-Kotkowski's 1962 experiments in South Australia with electronic light coincided with those of the Korean avant-gardist Nam June Paik. Ostoja-Kotkowski's planetary grammar of solar disks, spheres and orbs was quite a common vocabulary for many 60s abstractionists who employ light, like here Frank Hinder. And I'll just pause on Frank Hinder because it's a wonderful work, one of his first luminal kinetics. And as you can see from the inside, it's made from very much household utensils, bit of Meccano and a few colour gels from his work in the Teachers College here, where he worked with the students in student theatre. But the interesting thing is that, like Frank Hinder, Ostoja-Kotkowski's experiments took place at the same time as the international movement in light art, though at the time neither were required for the power collection. So their works have come in subsequently. Jean Tinguely's sculpture, Bascule, Seesaw, Syphisis, was another of the kinetic art works acquired in Europe in 1967 by the first power curator, Gordon Thompson. His junk sculpture, that is made of scrap metal, although by the time he was making this one, he was painting them all black, so they were unified from their original sources, performs a repetitive action. And we can go up afterwards and show you the foot pedal and give you a demonstration. Because it's over 50 years old, we can't have it running all the time, but we can do demos of it. It's titled Syphisis, and it's really condemned to endlessly repeat its motorized motion at the press of that foot pedal, and it has this mad jerking motion. Other kinetic works like those of the expatriates, and this is one of the Argentinian expatriates, Gregorio Vardanega, you can see in our black box. That's in fact 3 colour cycles, because it's in fact a single, like a hypnotic series of concentric circles that works its way through a range of light cycles. Another of the Argentinian expatriates was Julio Leparc, and his has, again, it's 3 versions, because as you can see at the base, there are these little drawers that allow you to pull out and change the mobile. So you can select whatever colour you feel like on the day, and likewise with the screen at the back. Leparc's work has a real lightness because the mobiles just shift with the air currents. The quality of vibration is not confined to literal motion, but extends to all kinds of optical sensations in the exhibition. And as Katrina will elaborate on Bridgette Riley's work, the optical sensations can flicker and dazzle in her remarkable art painting. But back to the Latin American exiles, they were largely grouped around a gallery called Gallery Denise René in Paris. Some of you would have known of that. And it's quite fascinating. Earlier, in the early 60s, René coined the term a multiple for editions like this one of Leparc's. And they were marketed in terms of greater accessibility, democratization, and so on. But you have to, these days, to acquire a Leparc or a Johnson multiple, they are quite beyond the reach of what they were intended to be back in the 60s. So in a sense, they entrenched, one could say, the commodity character of art by proliferating the glamour of contemporary collecting. So Leparc and his fellow Denise René artists, amongst them were Yvrel, whose work you'll see in the gallery, DeMarco, Martha Botto, and Tomasello, all worked together collaboratively at times in the Groupe de Recherche d'Art Visuel, which goes by the name of GRAV, G-R-A-V. They were, and this is a quote, inviting the viewer to demystify the artistic phenomenon, to pool your activities so as to clarify the situation and to set up new grounds for appraisal. GRAV is made up of painters who are committing their activities to ongoing research and the visual production of primary basic data aimed at freeing plastic art from tradition. And this was an image that Mark was going to use, and you can see the little Grave box-like bus doing a tour of various sites in Paris and setting up these happenings. In this case, this is Julio Leparc's walk in Montparnasse. At the time, the power collection was widely covered in the local press. There were front page photo stories in the Sydney Morning Herald, and John Henshaw, the Australian's art critic, explained at the time that the South Americans in the exhibition were part of Grave and in the Lumière et Mouvement exhibition at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris. So it was there that Gordon Thompson saw them and subsequently acquired these, most of them multiples, from Gallery Denise René. Among them was the expatriate Greek sculptor Taki, who worked with the Paris-based group Lumière et Mouvement, but then went on to England. And it was from there that he commissioned this particular signal series in 1968 as an unlimited edition of manufactured kinetic lightworks, which was sold for Documenta 4 in 1968. These early acquisitions were all European in orientation, and as you can imagine, pretty much focused on British, German and Italian neo-avant-gardists, in addition to the Latin American exiles who I've mentioned who participated in Grave. Now, just to finish, I do want to mention another way, another kind of light that is a very prominent part in the exhibition, and that is the reflected light, because many of the painters who didn't move into electric light worked with or experimented with light in reflection, shadows, and work like we have of Louis Tomasello's is a wonderful instance. When you first approach it, it appears like a monochrome relief until you see the reflections from the small rows of cubes which are attached obliquely to the white ground. Susan Best, one of the authors in our book, and there are some 16 different authors who've contributed to the book. She's written mainly on the Latin American artists, and on this work she writes of the tension between the austere geometric composition and the unexpected blooms of colour. And she draws attention to the strange power of colour to float and diffuse into the atmosphere like smoke. Another artist fascinated by reflections was Ian Byrne, who described his minimalist paintings based on either blue or yellow, colours associated with light and the sublime, as being on the extreme of the colour spectrum. And he writes, they were all monochrome or as mirror-like as I could make them. And it was obvious that much of what the viewer saw was random, due to accidents of hanging, conditions of lighting, etc. The blue reflex from 1966-67 is in fact painted with auto lacquer sprayed onto wooden panels, coated with clear fiberglass resin, and then polished layer upon layer like you'd treat the Duco surface on a new car. The only trace of his labour in the blue reflex appears along the thick edges of each panel, which expose the plywood base and wooden cleats. Its surface is neither blank nor inert, but animated by the viewer. As Byrne noted, this quote, reflections make up the main visual content. The work retains no fixed appearance. And two artists to end on, Alan Sondfist's Crystalline Enclosure, which in a different way is quite responsive to the viewer. His glass globe contains mineral deposits that crystallize on the interior, forming smoky purple haze. And as another of our fine writers, Nick Krogan, explains in the book, what it is in constant transformation, making visible processes of physical transformation that would ordinarily be beyond our sensory reach. Thus, it explicitly involves the observer as the heating and cooling is affected by physical presence. And even that this work has been out in the gallery for the last 2 months, the the crystals have changed. So you should come back and watch them change. Finally, to the Australian artist George Johnson, who I had written as the oldest living artist, but I just found out today that he had died, which is very sad. Johnson, like Frank Hinder and Tinguely, saw his work in terms of a Bauhaus legacy. He was responding to the basic elements of line, shape, ground, and colour. And he reflected and we use all through the exhibition the words of artists, and this is just a sentence from his words. The geometric is ordered, but its possibilities are endless. And you'll see his double-sided painting here has this wonderful centrifugal explosion coming from a black sun set against the white ground. So thank you very much for listening to me. And I'm now going to ask Tim Johnson to come up. Tim is an Australian artist who was born in Sydney in 1947, and he studied at the University of New South Wales and later here at the University of Sydney. He's exhibited regularly since 1970. However, it's his early work that we're fascinated to hear about. There are 2 major works on display in the exhibition. He's negotiated a range of influences from hard edge, colour field abstraction, minimal conceptual work, as well as performance. His early works involved utilising light sources, but I'll let him talk about that. Between 1970 and 72, he was involved in running the artist-led gallery Inhibidris with Mike Parr and Peter Kennedy. Johnson's subsequent work is known for a range of hybrid formulations, post-painting experiments, and his later cultural combinations with Aboriginal art and East Asian cultures. There was a major retrospective of Tim's work curated by Julie Ewington at the Art Gallery of New South Wales and at Queensland Art Gallery in Brisbane, and shown at Potter Gallery in Melbourne, and his work is held in major public collections. Please come up, Tim. Thanks.
That's for the pictures. Okay. Move. Which one do I push? The right hand one. Yep. Perhaps not. Anyway, I'd like to acknowledge the original owners of the country, past, present, and future. And I haven't prepared this talk, but I have thought a lot about it. So don't expect too much. I've got a few images to go along with it, but it's mainly going to be what I say, because how I got into doing light art is as follows. I was brought up by my parents my dad was very into the arts and friends with people like Lloyd Rees and even Marjo Hinder. So I was experienced to quite a lot of Australian art as a child, especially even to Guy Warren, who lived quite close to us and who my father used to ask to come and check out my work. And I showed him some of my latest paintings when I was a teenager, and he said, I think you should do more life drawing. And I thought that was ironic. When have you ever seen any of his life drawing? There's some strange people flying through the air. But I painted a lot as a child, and then in my teenage years went through a lot of influences, basically going from traditional to contemporary work, and I ended up painting abstracts by the age of about 17 or 18 in the late 60s. And I think I was strongly influenced by what I was reading in art magazines, and again through my parents, because in the late 60s my dad brought home some catalogues that included a show called Information and a show called When Attitudes Become Form. And in those catalogues there was a lot of recent conceptual work, and thus I was immediately exposed to ideas where the artwork wasn't just an object. It was, it wasn't just a cultural object, it was information, and the object itself could be the artwork and the information itself could be the artwork. So I became aware of things like performance art, conceptual art, and art that wasn't about aesthetics. So with that happening in my mind, and at the same time the processes I was going through, is it changing itself? Oh, well, I'll just let it, no, it's okay. Yeah, okay. Oh, you've got it. Yeah, sure. Like I said, it's mainly my ideas, and not so much the images, but that shows what it evolved into. But before that, the paintings became a bit like the content wasn't important. I became a minimalist. I like an impressionist, an expressionist, a kind of modernist, a minimalist, a bit of a pop artist. I was really just trying everything, and this parallel to that, the actual process was becoming more important than the style, and it ended up with the painting process dematerializing and doing things like cutting the canvas off the front of the frame, hanging it from the frame, just exhibiting the frame, and then before long switching to non-painting mediums. I didn't see myself as a sculptor. I saw myself as becoming a conceptual artist. And in 1970, I got a show at Gallery A, which was quite a good gallery in Sydney that had a lot of fantastic artists. And for that, I decided to use light as a material. I'll just go back through them. Oh, there we are. This was from that show. You can see there are monochrome canvases with lights inside them pointing out onto the wall. And I had the idea that the painting itself could create a colored environment, and work using perspex, and perspex as a sort of filter for a color source. That painting with those paintings on the wall, there are 4 blue canvases that are reversed, so that there's a kind of stretcher coming at the front, and across the stretcher goes some translucent perspex, so that the color you're looking at becomes very ambiguous. And it was just about a monochrome where the picture was the color, but the form of the painting was subverted by the anti-form treatment of the painting as an object. That was what was going on in my mind, like in my early 20s. At the time, I was producing a painting, but at the same time, it wasn't a painting. And I was thinking in terms of popular culture that you could hang the painting in your room and you could watch the painting instead of your TV set. And then down below, sort of serialized areas of perspex that are kind of just about the color and about that was a bit of a sculpture. But a lot of that work, I kind of later thought it's unsuccessful. Oh, it's a good one. Hang on a minute. There we go. Unsuccessful, partly because not many people bought it, but also the few that were left did, or actually, I'll talk about the multiple in a minute, but the few that were left did become collectible. And so, in a sense, to just give up on it was not necessary, but it was part of my own evolution in that I was moving on to do other things. But I think there are artists who stayed with that approach to art. Someone like, say, John Nixon, who just kept abstraction and colour and form and all that, the Bauhaus, as influences and found new ways to do it. But at Gallery A, there was also an artist called Peter Kennedy, who was doing light using neon tubes. And through him, I think I met Mike Parr. They lived next door to each other, and they were interested in starting an artists collective. So they called a meeting, and I was invited, and I joined up. And we started in Hibadress Gallery. The picture on the left is at Hibadress Gallery, and that's actually Mike Parr sitting in the chair. And I can't really show you, but there's something odd about that photo. Mike's face looks like, doesn't look like him at all. And have you ever seen the anonymous mask on your phone or on the internet? You know, the strange sort of theatrical, scary mask. That's what Mike's face looks like in that photo. I don't know why. And I'm throwing a light bulb around. I call it Flying Lights. And it was a light event, and I did it as a performance in the gallery when I had my shows, and I did it at a number of other locations. And it was about, I'd swing the light bulb around and let go, and it would fly through the gallery and land on the floor and explode, and the audience would gasp. And it was a sort of spectacular thing. It was kind of melodramatic, and that's what I meant it to be. Like an event, like a performance. And people like Donald Brooke, who was an art critic for the Herald, wrote it up as theatre, really, but as a new type of art. So it wasn't intended to change things, or it wasn't intended to get attention, but it did. And people do say conceptual art and performance art failed in the early 70s, mainly because it was sort of eventually taken out of what was being presented and because of post-modernism. But I think from the artist's point of view, it did not fail. It was laid a kind of basis and helped create a public for an artist's work. And I'd say Ian Byrne would be a good example of that, whose reputation was based on his conceptual work and language work. Pinacotheca Gallery on the right, an installation using light bulbs just hanging. There's a Sol LeWitt influence in my mind. As an Australian, I felt Australian art was lagging behind international art, and I was very interested in a lot of American artists and English artists and other European artists, just because of the experimental approach and the use of performance and installation. And so I adopted it when I went to Europe on a trip, like a honeymoon, actually. It was, I realized later. And I was exposed to a lot of recent art. And so I didn't have any paints or any materials. So I started making art with whatever was around me, like in the airplane, I photographed something on the window, and in the hotel room, I'd rearrange the lighting or rearrange the furniture, and I was creating installations as we progressed. And I used to use light sources for that. And that's sort of what you're seeing on the right, bit of like geometry in a sense. And then the performance where I was breaking the light bulbs, which I didn't really understand. Like, I don't know why I felt I wanted to break them. There may be some psychology in it. I don't know, but I was interested in people like Arthur Rimbaud, the symbolist poet, and he was promoting an attitude that was a bit antisocial. You know, the idea is you want to break down the traditions, you want to change what's there. So I thought breaking the light bulb was perhaps symbolic in a symbolist way, that I wanted to change things. This was a performance of the work at the NGV in the early 70s, where I just stayed at home and someone from the gallery did the work. I didn't realize at the time it was all a bit dangerous, and it even may still be, because not this work, this one was Perspex. Oh, hang on. Maybe they're out of order, yeah. That one on the left, which is called Type A, which was my multiple that I did for the first Gallery A show. I didn't know you had to earth the electricity, so don't touch it if you see it. I think it's in the show. Is that right? Yeah. And I found out since the people who owned them contacted me and then said they were dangerous, and they'd earthed it, had it, an electrician earth the artwork itself. But it's just something you didn't think of at the time. And even throwing the light bulbs was probably a bit dangerous. And there's another interesting little story. I've sort of gone for my time, haven't I? Almost. Yeah. Another interesting story. This happened at the university, where I was asked to give a talk at the architecture school in here, Sydney University. And I think Mark Ground was probably the person who invited me. You know him? He was like a lecturer in the architecture school and a sculptor. And it's quite interesting. He had a Joseph Beuys hat, like one of the hats Joseph Beuys used to wear, that an English artist had given to him, which he told me about. And I went to Central Australia and out to Papunya with Ma, and I don't know how to put it, but he's difficult to be with for a long period of time, because he borrowed a little two-stroke Suzuki from a friend in Alice Springs, and we drove out to Papunya, and they blew the radiator blew, and we had to go to the rubbish tip, and the Aboriginal people there actually helped us fix it. But apart from that, we would have got stranded out there. But anyway, I think Ma asked me to give this talk, and I was giving a talk, and I did a performance where I broke some of the lights in the auditorium with a broom, and everyone was, shocked and awe. Like you could imagine, if I said, well, this is my artwork, I'm going to break some lights here, and then everyone watches it, and it's not a big deal because you can just put new ones in, and they break anyway after a while. But the security guard ran to get the professor, ran upstairs and told the professor that some mad artist downstairs was smashing up the auditorium. And the professor came down, and it happened to be my dad, right? Because he was professor of architecture at Sydney Uni, and he said, it's okay. I understand it, it's his artwork, let him do it. So that was kind of interesting, that I actually got away with some of that sort of thing. And I did it on a train, a government train, where I broke a couple of light bulbs. But what I did is I replaced the light bulbs with my own ones and then broke them. And then out of that came this idea that I was a vandal, and this artist is breaking the law to make art. It's like vandalism as art, which I like because that was Arthur Rimbaud's thing. Vandalism, be antisocial, to go against what everyone else was doing, but only when you're young. You know, as you get older, you've got to sort of look at things differently. Otherwise, it's harder to survive. I think that's all. This is the artwork in the show. On the right, when it was shown at the MCA, in a light show they had, I think, in the early or late 90s. And I think it's the same piece. And I don't know what happened to the right-hand part, which is that little stand with a light bulb in it that shows the Tarkus influence. And the idea that I did want to make multiples, art that was mass-produced and that was cheap. And it did work at the time. The work sold quite well, and especially the type A, which is the one with the 4 light bulbs. It ended up at the MCA because they got work from the Power collection and they didn't know who'd done it. And it turned out I knew the people who were doing the inventory of the work at the MCA, and they thought it might be mine. They contacted me and they said they thought it was a Tarkus, which is flattering, but there's a big difference, I think. And that's it in the catalogue. You can see how the fact that it's about colour is important. Each time you see it, it looks different. And even in this show, it's got a light shining on it to bring out the colour a bit more, which was another type of installation I used to do. Just had an interesting experience in China when I was in the Guangzhou Triennial and walking around with the curator and some other artists, and there was a room there by Dan Flavin, and he was one of the light artists that influenced me in the beginning, along with Keith Saunier and Bruce Nauman, people like that. And there was this incredible room with lights, like there were neon tubes, no, not neon tubes, fluorescent tubes, but the lighting was about color, and it was just sort of hypnotic, you know, and kind of enchanting. We walked in and the lights there was nothing there except this color coming from the lights. And I said, hey, but I thought he died a few years ago. And he said, oh yeah, no problem. We just got the instructions from his estate to do the work. So I thought that was a pretty good approach, that you could actually go on producing art after you died. Do you want me to say any more or not? Enough? I think I've been through everything. The type A, then this paintings with the lights, which came before, then the multiple, and then a recent version of the light work from Gertrude Street Gallery in Melbourne, where they asked me to redo it. And they wanted me to redo my other art where I undressed people in public. Like I asked for volunteers from the audience and they came out and I undressed them, and they were meant to stop me, but they didn't. They wanted me to redo that and I said, no, thanks. Unless you want me to get arrested, or you could kind of do it then as a protest, but nowadays it would be politically totally incorrect. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Katrina's going to speak next, but we won't have time for questions, but Tim, after we finish, we'll go up to the exhibition, and if you want to talk to him in front of his work, that'll be an opportunity. Katrina Liberia, I have worked with for almost a decade here at the university, And it's been a delight to work particularly on this show, which we've co-curated. Her background was at the Museum of Contemporary Art, where she was working 98 to 2004, and then at the Biennale of Sydney from 2004 to 2009. And she's currently developing an exhibition on photography and performance, which will be following Coastline downstairs. And she's also a research student in art history here at the university, and is working on the life and work of an artist in our collection, a very little known but fascinating artist, Lily Greenham. So Katrina, step up.
Here we are. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Anne. Tonight, I'm going to be discussing two works in the exhibition, Light and Darkness upstairs. Oh, that's a bit better. Chromosphere 1967 by Peter Sedgley and Static 3 1966 by Bridgette Riley, artists whose works and lives intersected in the 1960s. There they are, if you can just make out Bridget bottom right. Peter Sedgley was born in London in 1930. He studied architecture at the Brixton School of Building from 1944 to 47, and then worked in the reconstruction of a post-war Britain. Disillusioned by the conservative constraints of his clients, whom he felt were out of touch with the new wave of modernism captivating London, in 1959, Sedgley turned to art. He met the artist Bridgette Riley in 1961, and they spent most of the 60s together and shared a studio. Together with, in 1968, together with art critic Peter Townsend of Studio International Art Monthly fame, they set up Space, a social enterprise that provides affordable artist studio spaces in London, which still exists today. Sedgley's early works included experimenting with surrealism. He made frottage rubbings and monotypes, followed by a study of constructivism, where he learned to break down colour and form. He also consulted the work of the neo-impressionist French artist Georges Seurat, studying how he translated light through his practice of chromoluminism. And like Seurat, he adopted a rigorous approach to colour theory. An autodidact, Sedgley has a research-based approach to making his work. In 1963, he began experimenting with different painting techniques, filling numerous notebooks with tests and studies, keen to work it out on paper before committing brush to canvas. He read Paul Klee's Thinking Eye and was staggered by it. It underpinned his self-analysis and set him on his path. He found that colour demanded fresh thinking about structure. Sedgley could be considered part artist, part chemist. He developed a scale of 8 colours, with yellow being the principal, and he strictly adhered to this formula. He was included in the groundbreaking exhibition, The Responsive Eye, the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1965, followed by the 1967 Tokyo Biennale. The Responsive Eye cemented his reputation as a leader in his field and saw Sedgley shown alongside the greats of the Bauhaus, including Joseph Albers, his English contemporaries, including Bridgette Riley and Jeffrey Steele, American heavy hitters Ellsworth Kelly, Ad Reinhardt, and Frank Stella, and the avant-garde groups of Grave, Equipo 57, Gruppo N, and the father of op art, Victor Vasarely. Sedgley exhibited blue and green modulations, here it is, 1964, which is one of his first circle works, and is a precursor to the development of his target paintings, which he made from 1966. In blue and green modulations, he introduces a circle, which is intercepted by a series of white lines disturbing the form. The effect on the eye is immediate, and from here Sedgley became bolder, his optical and luminal experiments more intense. Chromosphere, on the right, 1967, was one of Sedgley's first target paintings. The work was acquired by the inaugural Power curator, Gordon Thompson, in 1967, direct from Sedgley's studio. Thompson also acquired Riley's Static 3 on this same trip. Chromosphere consists of layered, brightly coloured concentric circles on a black ground which are activated by blue, red and yellow spotlights, creating an installation of saturated colour. Thompson was so impressed by the standalone painting that he agreed to purchase the work before it was finished. Sedgley later writing to Thompson, "The lighting program, which is 2 minutes long and then repeats, is full of variation and subtleties. Everybody was most excited about it, and it certainly justifies your courageous proposal to purchase it even though not fully complete." The title refers to the chromosphere, the second most outer layer of the sun, its red colour only visible during an eclipse. Upstairs on level 4, you can experience the work's intensity, its luminosity flooding its surroundings, and you can observe how the lights radically shift the colour of the work, as you can see there. At the time, Sedgley was critical of strict readings of the work, which suggests that as a work that has no up or no down, that it alludes to interstellar space, and the movement and colours are seen by the astronaut. Sedgley commented, "This means that people have tended to push the associative content back into a figurative situation, something they can understand. I think this is a pity because it tends to confuse the pure visual and emotive force that is the basic content of the work." Sedgley's aim was to produce the effects of pulsation and to give the impression that the shapes were in motion, like expanding and contracting irises. For Sedgley, the circle is a neutral, homogeneous form that encourages the audience to see the colour, not the shape. Reflecting on the symbolism of the circle, Sedgley says, "It is the only form that allows me to investigate colour in a way that I feel to be right. By using a circle, the effects are produced equally around the circumference." To make these works, Sedgley used a spray gun to create a seamless colour transition of diffusing or blurring effects, what he calls a system of controlled modulation. The balance of the paint and the spotlights was important. His aim was to remove any reference to the painted surface, such as the grain of the canvas. The result is a flawless and precise finish. For Sedgley, the painting needed to work technically, or it wouldn't work at all. Chromosphere marked a turning point in his career, which saw him move towards the light, using it from then on as his primary medium. Bridgette Riley, here she is again, was born in London in 1931. She studied at Goldsmiths College from 1949 to 52 and at the Royal College of Art from 1952 to 55. Her early influences include Henri Matisse, Pierre Mondrian, Jackson Pollock, and like Sedgley, she was hugely influenced by the work of Seurat. In 1959, she made her own version of his The Bridge at Courbevoie, 1886 to 87, making it bigger and closely followed his methods. Riley was fascinated by Seurat's use of colour to generate light. She considered it an active work requiring the viewer to take a role in its perception. Her version is on the right. At the time, Sedgley made Chromosphere and Riley made Static 3, 1966. They shared a studio. Their respective careers, and in particular Riley's, had just become international following the success of The Responsive Eye. Riley's work was included in the cover of the catalogue. So 1966 to 1967 was a period of intense experimentation for both artists. As Sedgley moved further towards light, Riley was on the cusp of moving from her striking black and white works to adding colour in 1967. By the time Riley made Static 3, 1966, she had completely removed her hand from the work, around 1962, and was now working with assistants. Her rationalisation was this gave her the required critical distance she needed to evaluate her works. Like Sedgley, Riley made numerous studies and was and still is prodigious in her working her ideas out on paper, and is renowned for her rigorous work ethic. This is a study for Static, which is this. Static 3 is a late black and white painting, one of 4 static works that she made. The work is comprised of a square canvas measuring 163.5 by 163.5 and is larger than her previous works. The picture plane is covered in black ellipses which are painted on a white ground. The ellipses pivot and from top to bottom there is bilateral symmetry. Riley has described looking at the work as inducing visual prickles caused by the deployment of after images. Cyril Barrett, the art historian and critic, agreed and described the work in his book Op Art 1970, saying, "What Bridgette Riley is giving us is the visual equivalent of a sensation. Static refers to static electricity. If we concentrate on these tiny dots, we begin to experience the intense prickly sensation, the failure to come to terms with the spatial location of these undifferentiated pulsing sources of energy. At the same time, we are aware that the source of all this confusion is something simple and regular." Riley is ambitious and exacting and is not afraid to challenge the viewer. They are forefront in her mind. Of her 1960s paintings, she's commented that, "I wanted the space between the picture plane and the spectator to be active. It was in this space, paradoxically, that the painting took place." In our book, again, Light and Darkness, Lynn Cook provides the artist's own account of making the work. "I was going up a mountain in France which had a vast expanse of shale at the top. It was an extremely hot day. Visually, it was total confusion. I felt there was no possibility of understanding the space of this situation. You couldn't tell whether this was shimmering shale, if this shimmering shale was near or far, flat or round. One of us said it was like the desert. We found it so alarming that we got out of the car, which of course intensified the situation. But it was much cooler at the top, and into my mind came the beginning of static, a mass of tiny glittering units like a rain of arrows." Although her work is abstract, Riley always responds to experiences in the real world. She wants there to be a flicker of recognition, for the viewer to experience something known and something unknown. Riley used perception as a medium, as a device, but not as the subject. In Static 3, the subject is light. Following Static 3, Riley made the Deny paintings from 1966 to 67. These paintings continued with the disorientating visual effects, with Riley introducing other tones, including blue and red. Like in Static 3, she employs the ellipses. The inclusion of colour is hard to see. It's denied to the viewer, as the title implies. Here a subtle shift took place, but it was an important one that would see her future work transformed into full-blown colour. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katrina, and thank you, audience, for being so attentive. We are over time, but as I mentioned earlier, Tim and Katrina will join me upstairs if you'd like to come, and we can have a experience in the black box, and I can also show you the Tinguely doing its Sisyphus-like rock. So thank you very much, and come upstairs.